Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and with me this morning is author, activist, and journalist Justine Barron. We're going to be joined in a little bit by Renee Johnston as well, but good morning, Justine. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself if they haven't seen us before.
Okay, hi, I'm Justine. I wrote a book. It's called They Killed Freddie Gray, The Anatomy of a Police Brutality Cover-Up. You can get it on Amazon or at, your local independent bookstore. So I've been doing independent journalism. My areas of topic are crime, disability, and I particularly like to do media criticism. And that's me. The Substack that he has listed, it's a column I started recently called Criminalizing Disability. It looks at the intersection of criminal justice and disability. The intersection that is and always has been.
And it's worth noting that while we talk about about how the police treat black people all the time, the cops treat disabled people the same. So it's a very useful intersection to pay attention to.
Yes, about 50% of people that are killed by police are disabled.
Which is not something we always remember, and it's important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Yes. One of my bête noirs or issues of concern is how certain leftist communities that focus on issues like policing, like Palestine, have currents of ableism in them, which makes no sense because if you really look at policing and if you really look at Palestine, they are about disability. They are about disabling populations. They are about targeting the sick and infirm.
That's
So
why you shoot at hospitals. You don't shoot at hospitals because you really think some terrorists are using them as bases.
exactly.
Well, I take that back because there was that one thing in Russia where terrorists actually, well, not Russia, Ukraine, where terrorists actually were using a hospital as a base, and the UN said so, but we still couldn't get it out of the media. And I just wish we could hold people to the same standard we hold Russia to sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Renee. Hi.
Good
Hi.
morning, Renee.
This is my first time meeting you.
I know, after all, it's been like a year of chatting on Twitter, so it's really nice to meet you.
You too. We were just talking about how like certain movements that the left takes up, like policing and Palestine, are really disability issues in a lot of ways, and how those communities, those activist communities, often don't want to address that part of it. So we were talking about the targeting of hospitals, and Chris was mentioning, well, there are. See, here's the thing, Chris. Like, yes, there may be terrorists might have figured out that hospitals are a safe place to hide, but when governments destroy entire hospitals, that's them saying that they don't care about the sick and infirm. They don't consider them civilians.
Exactly. Or important enough, even necessarily human enough to worry about not hitting them with a bomb meant for someone else.
Exactly. And that's, the first stage of almost every fascist movement is the wiping out of the disabled. And when you talk about wiping out people based on race or sexuality, you're also in a lot of ways talking about disability, but that gets very deep because it's really about the othering of human bodies and the inferiority of human bodies.
And it's really scary right now because, like you said, it's where most fascism starts. The Nazis started by bitching about how much it was costing the German healthcare system to pay for healthcare for people who were disabled by the Spanish flu.
Correct.
And so when I see everything that I see about COVID or don't see about COVID in the media, as the case may be, it comes back down to that same thing. All right. So where do we where do we start saying, hey, this is serious and we need to pay attention? I think we start now. We should. I've been trying to say something for a while, but it seems like everybody wants to forget about COVID, forget about sick people, and just try to pretend to go on with normal life.
Which is crazy because I know more people with COVID right now.
Yeah.
I know many people who have COVID right now.
I mean, I acquired COVID in June of 2020 and I never recovered. So I have long COVID. Oh, we lost Renee. And
she's coming back. She's going from the car to the house.
Okay. So my experience of COVID has never been, even if I wanted to, I could never minimize it because I'm sick every day because of it. And, you know, the shocking experience that I had in the last couple of years, which a lot of disabled people had, was that all of a sudden my communities and allies turned on me. And we're having events during searches without mask mandates. If I spoke about that, I got stigmatized. I got accused of policing. So it was like very depressing, but, you know, I emerged from it with a real sense that there is no political home for the disabled, period.
And there's no, it's like, it's like there are large categories of people who just aren't human, and the tendency is to invade capital, is to blame capitalism for everything. But it is important to understand that there has always been a strain of this in socialism too. Marx's daughter and son-in-law lived into their 70s and then killed themselves in their 70s because they believed they were not contributing meaningfully to world revolution anymore at their age.
Yeah, I mean, think about what collectivism is, period. Like, collectivism is the assumption that we can all buy into a similar standard and approach to life. And disability is the radical disruption of that. Because disability takes 1,000 forms. You know, a lot of the arguments that I have on the left will sort of take the form of, you know, people pushing for transit, it's stigmatizing car driving. And if you mention that, you know, some disabled people have cars specifically outfitted for them, some of us can't ride transit for a whole host of reasons. And a lot of times the return will be, well, isn't all disability mobility challenge? And it's like, no, actually, it's a lot of things. It's people who can't stand up for long because they have POTS, you know, their blood pools, and they get dizzy and faint. It's people that can't tolerate certain environments because of smells, because of COVID, because of sounds. It's people who are allergic to the outdoors. You know, it's very broad.
It's people whose immune systems are compromised, but who look 100% healthy in every other way.
It's people who don't tolerate extreme heat or cold. And so when we talk about like true disability justice, we're looking for a world that really does the best it can to accommodate everybody, assuming that everybody is of value. And when you look at collectivism and socialism, it's not really coming from that point of view, usually. But a lot of collectivism and socialism is unfortunately bought up in capitalism. Like, it hasn't really radically reached the point it should. A lot of socialists like fetishize hard labor. They think everyone should be working hard.
I've got to go back to it was there since the beginning again. I will once again name drop in history. Marx wrote a lot about how socialism would mean more productivity and unleashing productive forces to better the cause of human life. So, I mean, we've got this idea that socialism is going to produce like capitalism on steroids in some sense, in some corners of the movement. If you look at the USSR under Stalin, they had what they called the heroic labor movement, where people who did massive amounts of extra work and did impossible things were treated as heroes and given awards and state dinners and all this stuff. But we're still talking about a guy working 90 hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see this now, a lot of and we've talked about this on here, and we could talk more about long COVID specifically, because that would be a great conversation.
Yes.
But we see a lot of these like arguments fomented on social media against people who use like Instacart and stuff. And a lot of the people who argue about it, and when disabled people talk about, and the evidence is, by the way, that the top users of DoorDash, Instacart, etc., are the lowest earning.
Yes.
And a lot of that is disability, and a lot of that is other life complications.
And just mobility. I know not all disability is mobility, but not all mobility is obvious.
Right.
I was epileptic when I was a teenager. I had a relapse of symptoms as an adult. That means I don't drive. Now, I'm a strapping, healthy guy in lots of ways, but let me tell you, it's a serious disability in modern society not to drive.
Yes, especially in certain environments. Yeah.
100%. Well, I used to live in East Tennessee on the Tennessee-Virginia border, where public transportation is not particularly well developed.
Exactly.
I was dependent on my wife driving and on getting rides from friends.
Yes, and if I may, like with long COVID, which we know is just taking over the population, 2 years ago, it was 4 million out of work in this country alone, something I deal with. The two of the most common conditions caused by long COVID, so that people understand this, because first of all, it's happening to you and it's happening to people you care about. And second of all, you need to know why this should affect your movements. So one of them is called myalgic encephalomyelitis. It is commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome, but that's a terrible name for it. And it is a post-viral complication or continued infection where you cannot exert, you cannot exercise, you cannot do a lot of hard, even mental labor, because you have such little capacity. And this has to do with clotting in the blood and blood flow and damage to the blood vessels. And it's a very confusing illness. I had it, and like the fact that I couldn't improve by exercising was confusing to me, that I would crash sometimes for weeks. And so that's one. And the other one is POTS that I mentioned, postural orthostatic intolerance or syndrome, where your blood pressure plummets and your heart rate goes up from changing position or activity or standing still. And so and then you get dizzy and you pass out. And so these conditions, if you think about it, are really like disruptive to certain socialist ideals. You just can't participate in the same way. And so these are people who need services brought to the home, who need, extreme accommodation, but also need to have a voice in our movements. And I saw a tweet the other day and I've seen this so much for so many years, even long before COVID, where she asked a group, like, why aren't you, having masks at your Palestine protest? And it was in like some kind of Discord or something, or Slack. And they basically mimicked Hitler's idea of kind of useless eaters, that the disabled are useless eaters, by saying like, well, this will weed out. This was a leftist group saying like, we will weed out the people who can't do the work. And
no,
it's like, yeah.
And there's been, and again, that's a strain that's been there. I mentioned the suicides of Marx's daughter and son-in-law.
It's great.
Oscar Wilde, not Oscar Wilde, I'm sorry. I hate it when I get my Irish authors mixed up. Give me a moment. Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, why can't I remember his name when it most matters? Irish, big deal, socialist.
Yates?
What?
Yates?
No, no, no. It doesn't matter. But the eugenic strain was in socialism even before the Nazism stuff.
Yeah.
There was an idea. It's like the best example, the idea of useless eaters is already inherent to socialism because that is the only possible description for capitalists who are greedy monsters who eat everything and don't produce anything useful at all. The problem is that it's so easy to get caught up in the idea of useless eating in the micro and blame individuals for their circumstances
Exactly.
instead of blaming systems and doing something about the social organization. We love to get sidetracked by blaming individuals for things. The discourse that you're talking about ableism and services like Instacart and DoorDash, that takes a form. It's a very well established form. Someone who is not disabled and who really does seem like they're kind of a whiny and entitled sort of person makes a certain kind of tweet whining about, oh, this awful person from insert service here. And then a bunch of people start, to some extent, legitimately pointing out what's going on. And then someone else says, yes, but people in X situation don't have many other choices. And that's why this can actually be a big deal. At which point, everyone then jumps on that person and makes disability the issue and they treat the people talking about disability as if they were defending the original asshole instead of as if they were trying to recenter the conversation.
Or as if they were defending an exploitative system.
Yeah.
And in fact, there aren't a lot of these like pit the worker against the disabled person.
Yes.
The problem is it's not clean cut. And a lot of the workers that do this will say, well, a lot of workers are disabled. It's like, exactly. That is all the more reason you should understand those disabled workers become those disabled unemployed people.
Yes.
That's exactly how it happens. They don't get to stay working forever. And then they say, well, how could that be? They have no choice but to work. And it's like, now you're starting to get it. There are disabled homeless people, like a lot, because
a lot of homeless stories start with I became disabled and so I couldn't work and so I couldn't pay my rent.
About half. Yeah. It's a really large number. Yeah. And yeah. So, and I think if we go back to the origin, and I really appreciate you pointing out this story about Marxist kids and the ableism that was in socialism from the beginning. Socialism and fascism, like these movements arose at the same time. And typically when movements arise at the same time, there's like a dialectic connection.
Well, there was, if you look at the progressive movement, and by the progressive movement, I specifically mean the original progressive movement just before World War I, end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, what they call the progressive era. Some of it really was better. And there were people who were really saying important things. The best example I can think of is Upton Sinclair, who in The Jungle really writes about people becoming disabled and its consequences for their lives as part of the normal working experience of Americans. And the progressive era saw this as an argument to create the FDA. And Upton Sinclair famously said, I aimed for America's heart and I hit them in the stomach.
Wow.
But he writes this book about the meatpacking industry that talks about people being killed and disabled on the job and family tragedy and these huge traumas in the lives of working people, and we get the FDA. Which is not to say that the FDA isn't important or that we shouldn't have standards for consumers. But Upton Sinclair wasn't just writing about the horrible things that the meatpacking industry does that doesn't keep us safe when we eat meat. Upton Sinclair was writing about what it was like to work in the meatpacking industry. That was the point.
Yeah.
And that was missed.
Well, there were gains in the labor movement, you
Yes.
know, and almost all of them have to do with disabled advocacy.
Yes.
Like sick time, OSHA,
A
workplace.
40-hour week, which
All
it
of
should be noted. Right. It should be noted that we talk about the 40-hour week like we've won it, and a lot of Americans still work more than 40 hours.
Most people work more. So, but the thing is, what's interesting is, what the disability community has been pointing out is that the labor community has turned on us with COVID. But I know that it precedes that. And I'm sort of wondering, because I know it was happening before, because the Instacart wars were happening before COVID.
And I do want to say, as an essential worker, the labor movement has turned against disabled people and workers themselves in a lot of ways long before COVID, but COVID really made it obvious. It's true.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Sorry. My life on a Sunday. I'm sorry.
Hey, well, it's great. We're glad you could join us.
Our lives too.
I have been listening though, and I honestly, part of the issue here is this is not something I'm well versed in. So the beauty of me being on is I'm like learning a lot. Listen to you both talk about it. And one of the things that kind of occurred to me is there's also there's an intersection here in class, right? So something that I think people also miss, because I heard you all talking about, who orders to go a lot, right? Like, who are these people who are always using DoorDash and all these places, and then Chris talking about not being able to drive. If you live in a place and you don't have a car, how do you get food if you don't get it delivered, right? Like,
my wife and I, and I'm going to say it, I don't care if people get pissed. I also tend to tip 25% no matter what, even if my wife gets mad at me. So there's that too. But if we get home from work, my wife gets home from work and she's been sick all day and she's just gotten me home from work and I'm tired from working, we order DoorDash if we don't have the energy to cook, or go back out to get takeout after we've gotten home. Because there are more choices that way than if we get takeout on the way home. Some of them are better choices with better food than, just drive-through stuff.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, Renee, it gets caught in these conversations, in these tedious, awful conversations. It usually gets framed as privilege to ever be able to use it. Right. And then you just pull up the stat that it is mostly people that earn under $10,000 that use it. And there's a lot of categories that we call disability adjacent, which are, because again, disability sort of encompasses all things. Historically, there were ugly laws were, and they still exist in some places, ugly laws where, if you didn't appear a certain way that fit with society, you were not legally allowed to be outside. And this continues in anti-vagrancy laws, Right. And so what I'm saying is that disability is at the bottom of a lot of things. And so what you were talking about, Renee, what we call these disability adjacent categories. For instance, a pregnant woman or a mother with very small children. She is now carrying children. She is not physically able to do a lot of things. Being remote, not having access to certain things. These are disabling conditions in a sense. That doesn't mean that disability doesn't exist as its own category. It just means there's a lot of adjacency. And I've definitely talked to, in my discussion about transit and how the transit activists need to be more disability aware, a lot of times people will reach out to me and say, I really tried to keep riding buses and trains until I had 2 small children.
Yeah.
So these are these adjacent
And
categories, and they tend to correspond to poverty, because being wealthy now gives you the ability to hire,
and let's face it, some of these folks who attack people as privileged for talking about the reality of these issues would probably be some of the first people to complain if that mother with small children had her small children on the bus they were taking to work and it was really annoying them.
That gets to the deep issue of assholes.
Well, that was one of and that's one of the really fundamental things that you really have to understand, that's going to be an issue regardless of what system that we adopt, is that until we actually reach the point that Marx is talking about, where we evolve into better people on the social and interpersonal level, there's always going to be assholes.
Yes.
I mean, because at its core, really, like if we stop trying to categorize people in these multiple ways, right? Like, you're this and you're this and you're this and you're this, and recognize that people just, we're all humans. And if you just respect humanity as like, I respect the fact that you should be able to live and to breathe and to eat and to live and to not sleep in the rain and all these things, a lot of this doesn't happen, but you have the assholes, as Justine so aptly put it. And they just, there's this need to always categorize and make a determination as to why you shouldn't have the thing that I have. And I've never quite understood why it's that way.
And I'm going to say one more thing too, just to recognize this about myself. And I think if we're really honest, we can all recognize this. Sometimes we're the asshole.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And when I really want to say that when I complain about these things, I'm including myself to a real degree, because I find myself guilty of many of the things I'm talking about, and then I try to do better. And often that's what leads to me talking about it, because I'm trying to do better myself. And sometimes Justine and I will disagree about things and stop talking for a little while because we don't want to argue and we just want to sort of think about it.
Yeah, we stop. Like, I'll put a pause on that conversation, but I'll always talk to you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And me too. Definitely. I've been caught on things. I was the enemy of Twitter one day because I said that yoga was a myth.
So
I'm still anti-yoga, but
there are a lot of. So I'm pro yoga if yoga is working for someone.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
Anti-yoga as a sort of magical fix-all for all of a human being's problems. There is no magical fix-all for all of humanity's problems.
Yeah.
One of the fundamental realities of life is that problem solving, and this is in the end why I am a collectivist despite all the bitching we're doing, problem solving is a social activity, or it doesn't actually solve problems.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think one of the ways that I like to speak about this is praxis, Praxis,
Yes.
over principle.
Yes.
Like, a lot of young leftists especially get a list of principles. Cars bad, this good, and they don't have the capacity to engage. And so they get like really reactive. And so the example I gave before about people asking for mask mandates at the Palestine, event, and being dismissed and told, well, obviously you're not the kind of people we want. That's an example of that, because if your principle is you have to show up for Palestine, period, and somebody says, I have these reasons I can't, if you don't have any praxis for engagement, first of all, you lose elections, you lose everything, you lose support, and most of the disabled people I know, almost all, have left the Democratic Party and have left their leftist groups for this reason.
Well, I mean, the best example that I can think of is the fact that in 2022, the Democratic, not just the Democratic Party, but very specifically DSA, made an active decision to give up any sort of dialogue with the White House on COVID and essentially to accept Biden's "the pandemic is over" bullshit as legitimate. And they ended up running a state Senate candidate in New York who was so the pandemic is so sure that the pandemic is in the rearview mirror that Nomiki Konst looked good by comparison. And she was the only person talking about COVID in the state of New York, it seemed like, in the 2022 election. And I thought about that for a moment. Really, she didn't stay in long and she dropped out. But this state Senate election was very, very revealing in that all these people who said we have to take over the Democratic Party because of X, Y, and Z completely abandoned the idea of taking over once Biden was actually president and instead became just absolute submissionists in so many ways. And soon after that, you started seeing people in supposedly left-leaning magazines essentially echoing the Leanna Wen,
or echoing the far right. Basically.
Well, that's the thing. Leanna Wen was just, a Washington Post voice that was echoing the far right in all these ways. And then Natalie Schuer is suddenly sounding like Leanna Wen.
Oh, yeah, she has since the beginning, but that's because her husband probably profits off of COVID denial. So they have Natalie Schuer, these prominent DSA folks are not being called out for COVID minimization at all. And one day there was this lady, Mindy Iser, is like a Philly DSA person.
Yes.
She was like, why are people still fear mongering about COVID? I just want to gather with 60 of my closest friends at a restaurant, right? But meanwhile, they will go after you for using Instacart. But when did restaurant workers become somehow not exploited? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But, I asked the question on Twitter, like, why does DSA have any position on Mindy Iser saying this, calling it fear mongering to care about not wanting to expose to a tuberculosis level pathogen?
Yeah.
And I got just so much hate, and the hate.
I remember that.
From DSA accounts and the real accounts. And the hate took the form of, ask the manager, calling the manager. But it also took the form of, you're crazy, all these ableist terms. There's just no disability information in those communities.
What makes me so angry, and again, I'm going to beat the essential worker drum too, because I think that essential worker, the people you remember now, when's the last time you've heard someone in media refer to an essential worker, by the way?
2020.
And now let's point out that what the word essential worker symbolizes is we discovered that some of the most exploited and least well-treated people in this country are actually the most important for its daily operation.
Yeah.
The dude in the call center, and the lady in the Carl's Jr., and the barista at the place you get your coffee. These are people who actually do a lot more for the daily function of our society than CEOs and media people and corporate executives. These were the people who couldn't stay home from work, who had to be working no matter what. People in retail, in supermarkets. and at gas stations. These were the people who had to work no matter what. People in infrastructure, electricians, people who work with electricians on the phone, supporting them, their dispatchers, tech support, all sorts of people never had a lockdown in the way that DSA people or the angry I want to eat at the restaurant guy on the far right experienced it. I was going to work every day unless I was using up sick time in order to stay home during the height of the so-called lockdowns.
Right.
But it was also about making sure the people who kept the rich people super comfortable didn't stay home, right?
That's what essential means. Because I mean,
it was the bizarrest. Like I was like, wait, all of a sudden, like
not even necessarily
care about the person who works in the liquor store. Like what is going on right now?
Not even necessarily just the rich people, but everybody who feels a certain level of self-entitlement because of their success in whatever way. So they might not be rich. They might be a dude who owns a Denny's. They might be a used car dealer. Well, though a used car dealer is pretty rich from my point of view, but still. They might not be what we think of as the wealthy, and yet they might still have a set of ideas that are based entirely on their sense of what they've accomplished in the world and why they deserve special treatment for it.
And that's fair. I mean, the whole, even like looking back on it, the ability to be home and work from home was also its own set of, it wasn't necessarily that you were rich, but you were able to do it, and there was a privilege that came with being able to say, like, I can still get a paycheck and not leave my house.
I am also going to be the first person to say that there is a lot of privilege in working for an employer who takes COVID relatively seriously,
right?
Who started reducing the number of people in buildings by having like 2/3 of the people working from home whenever they can, so that like somebody is in the week 1 week and then working from home 2 weeks and then in the office again. And so between rotating and making sure we have masks for free, I have an employer who actually has taken it seriously, and this has helped me and people I work with have a lot less sick time than people who are less fortunate.
And probably help their bottom line,
Yes, like probably.
I work in nonprofit, usually like grant writing and stuff. And for the first time, because I was already disabled before long COVID, I was working as a contractor for nonprofits because it was the only way I could work from home, and then for years with disability. But it's since 2020 up until now, there's so many more remote jobs because the nonprofit industry figured out how much money they're saving by shutting down infrastructure.
Right.
And, those are organizations like small companies and nonprofits that really every cent that they can save makes a huge difference.
But then you also see the Wall Street and big corporate backlash where people at the very highest levels realize that they lose control over people at the smallest levels, that tiny bit, if they're at home instead of the office. And you see the backlash against remote work, which is really ableist again, because it hurts the ability of people who can't leave their home to be able to find work.
There's so many, even a lot of the work from home stuff, like my current employer does not require the Zoom camera. And I can't even tell you the difference it's made in my life. So we have meetings all the time. And because I have POTS, I can often be on my back for that meeting.
Yes.
And much more productive. And again, POTS is like an epidemic now because of long COVID. And so there's so many more ways, But I think the whole the backlash against work from home, I really feel like so much of it is driven by these investment firms that have taken over the entire world, that own all the properties, that own the old age homes, because they own those commercial properties and they just want people in them and they want people paying rent.
Or worse,
most businesses are really happy to have some people home.
Or worse, they manage them for the real owners. Corporate property management is just so huge these days. The typical apartment building here in Oregon is owned by some private landlord, usually somebody really rich who needs some sort of passive income investment, or even retired people who don't want to work and need a passive income investment. And so this corporate management company runs it, because obviously this person isn't going to be running this huge apartment complex themselves, even if they own it. And so what you have is you have an actual property owner who doesn't exist as far as the tenant is concerned. And you have a landlord who's an employee on site.
Yeah.
And you have a corporation that makes all the rules. Now, this corporation is responsible both for ensuring the passive income of its clients and making a profit itself for its owners and investors. And so this is one of the reasons your rent goes up all the time. This is one of the reasons buildings that start out rent controlled, and we want disabled people to live here. We want working people to live here. 5 years later, everybody's thrown out when the rent goes up.
Right.
And it's because
or you live in a place where they board up the doors and windows while you're still inside because they want you to move out.
You have this one more level.
Oh, that's a real thing. Justine's like, what? It's a real thing. It's a real thing in Illinois. They literally boarded up the building with people still inside of the apartments.
Which is, it should be noted, a crime. Yeah. Has anybody been prosecuted?
No, I don't even know if I need to follow back up because I don't even know if there was an elderly man, there was a woman with 2 children, like boarded up inside.
Because to put this in context, the Nazis tried to board us up in our apartment buildings is something that poor Black people in Ottawa were saying during the trucker convoy besieging the city. Just to put that statement in context.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Would you mind to switch topic?
Sure.
Because I see the clock, and when we talked about me doing this,
yes,
something that we talked about us talking about that is really obscure to a lot of people, and I want to inform them, which is some of the battles that go on within long COVID.
Yes, this is important.
And it's really related to everything we're talking about. So just because I don't think a lot of people know, and a lot of people are acquiring long COVID every day as we speak, like thousands and thousands and thousands. I talk to them all the time.
There are probably people right now who have long COVID who don't know they have COVID.
Right.
Who don't know they ever had COVID.
That's a fact because it can happen from an asymptomatic or a mild infection. Mine was very mild, and then I've never recovered. So what happened in long COVID discourse is, and a lot of the big accounts you see will sound like what I'm talking about. It started out, long COVID discourse was really following the long time people who had infection associated illness, whether from Lyme or Epstein-Barr, etc. And most of them had this illness I told you about, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS. And so the original community of long COVID patients, and I was one of them in 2020, we were talking about exercise intolerance, we were talking about the importance of rest, we were talking about ME/CFS and POTS. And what happened is so many people became disabled for the first time in their life. And with other diseases, and I know because it happened to me, you become disabled for the first time of your life and you confront a ton of internalized ableism. Everybody has it. I still have it. Because you feel like the loss of your ability to do all the things you do makes you worthless and makes you feel like you don't have identity. So much of identity is tied up there.
My wife says things like, "I'm sorry for letting us down," when she feels too sick to drive. So I know exactly what you mean.
That's the feeling, and it's normal. But what happened is now we have so normally newly disabled people take a long time to understand that they're disabled, take a long time to connect with disability community, keep thinking a cure is going to happen to them in a few months, keep waiting for it to pass. Like, this is all normal. I went through it for the first 5-6 years of disability before I really kind of was like, okay, I got to fix this because this isn't working for me. But what happened now with long COVID is that it's such a mass of people. It's millions. And there's so many newly disabled people. And they've taken over long COVID discourse. And they have a ton of hatred for other patients. And they have a ton of hatred in particular for the ME/CFS community. And they're denying that they have that illness. And they want long COVID to only be understood as similar to HIV. So you'll see that a lot. And there was a hashtag airborne AIDS.
I saw that.
And the thing about it is that long COVID, we are learning, can, in some percentage of people,
it causes
AIDS.
Any. Let me put it another way, because this is one of the things that was getting HIV activists specifically upset. I saw this in a couple of conversations. Any autoimmune deficiency, if it reaches the point where it becomes serious enough, is going to look and feel like AIDS to the person experiencing it, because once you reach that level of breakdown where any opportunistic infection can kill you, it doesn't matter what you call it. People in that situation have the same set of needs and concerns and issues.
Yes. But more specifically, AIDS is a T cell count of 200 below. And that's happening to some long COVID patients. It's just not happening to all of us. And long COVID is presenting far more heterogeneously. But what is happening in a majority of long COVID cases is this exercise intolerance, this ME/CFS illness. And that community that I'm talking about, the ableist patients, I call them the jocks because they're so caught up in their former ability. They say hateful things about disability. They refuse to acknowledge it. They're waiting for their HIV cocktail. And I don't think long COVID is going to be fixed in the same way. It's not appearing the same for everybody. And a lot of it comes out of internalized ableism. Some of it comes out of underdiagnosis. Like, these people don't know what's wrong with their immune system. Like, sorry to get a little boring and technical, but I do want to share this with people. T cell count isn't the only immune system. My T cells are high, like too high, but I have low IgG. Like, there's various immune systems. HIV and AIDS showed up in one way. This is showing up in a lot of ways, and we need connection and solidarity with disability. And we don't have time for people to work through their internalized ableism through hatred.
And let's...
It's mostly white men, by the way.
Yeah.
Long COVID discourse, long COVID predominantly affects women, trans people, women, and people of color are the most affected. But the community is being sort of led, or they're trying to, by these white guys formerly abled.
Well, I mean, and let's...
Does that make sense? I'm sorry, Renee.
Of course it makes sense. Of course it makes sense, because let's be honest. White men are loud, and we think that we have something useful to offer even when sometimes we don't. And we get sidetracked on our own thoughts because people are less likely to check us when we do. And so there are all these little reasons why I need to be more conscious of whether I'm being an asshole. To be an asshole and get away with it. And so it's just something that, as a result, white men who don't practice a certain amount of self-control are just more likely to be assholes. And those are experienced it. Sometimes we've been it.
And so I think it's almost like a message for me is, hey, pups. The pup is like, white men, indeed.
I just wanted everyone to understand what I'm dealing with. I'm really sorry, Nazareth. Sorry. He finally woke up. There we go.
Well, listen, I just kind of want to give a lesson here because I want newly disabled by long COVID people to know that you're not just going to get better support, but you're going to get better information and you're going to get better diagnosis and better treatment by leaning into the long-time disability communities for ME/CFS and POTS. That's where I got on antivirals. That's where I got properly diagnosed. It's not from trying to make long COVID. It is its own unique thing, but it has history. And like, that is where you're going to get better. Like, I manage my illness much better now because of those communities and those doctors. And a lot of patients are like, darn it, I'm not that. I'm just waiting for my HIV pills. I'm waiting for my cure. And honestly, the cure mentality, very, very, very few illnesses get cured. You want to hope for managing symptoms. Like, that should be the proper, and they hate that. They're so turned off by that because they feel like it's accepting defeat. Like, name the illness that got cured, not even AIDS, it's just not happening. You manage, right? Anyway, I'm sorry for my long
No, that's
and I'm glad you explained a lot because there, so me being in the circles that I'm in with so many different people, knowing that long COVID has been from a long time ago when people were like, there's no such thing as long COVID. And I was like, there's definitely such a thing as long COVID, and understanding how, the different ways that's kind of showing it, in different people. And so this was very helpful. And I also, it's, for me, part of it also is because we are where we are, cure is not ever a thing because the money is in the treatment, right? Like that.
Wall Street has said,
right?
One of the guys from one of the big investment firms said to one of the pharmaceutical companies, curing disease is a bad business model.
Right. The money's all in the pills and the go to the doctor and the visit.
And that's why everything that has symptoms now has a commercial with a three-letter abbreviation and a prescription drug.
Right.
And it's heartbreaking to think about that. I have a relative who's very young now with cancer, and she sort of said, shouldn't she just, started treatment? She said, shouldn't we have better options? She has like a small stage 1 tumor and she has to go through rounds of horrible. Sorry, just to say, like, that is a fact, and it is heartbreaking. And at the same time, we can be mad at all of that and still try to live our lives as like worthwhile disabled people, if that makes sense, because that could chip away at you. But not all of us are like part of this world that is harming and disabling us. And it's going to happen to everybody at some point. Like, unless they just get shot at the height of health,
Everybody who lives long enough will become disabled. It is the universal human condition. Shakespeare talks about second childhood in the late 15, early 1600s in As You Like It.
Right.
It's just a fact. If you live long enough, you're going to be physically and or cognitively impaired. The only people who don't face some degree of disability, even if it's just as simple, I can't do everything I used to do the same way I do it without sitting down and resting a little longer. It's just the fact. And it's one of the problems. We see it. We know it's going to happen to us. And so we don't want to see it, which is this whole idea that you see online all the time when people complain about how liberals are people who just want to be comfortable. This is where the ugly laws come from. I don't want to see that person. Hide them. This is where the homeless laws come from. You're right. It's the same as the ugly laws. I don't want to see homeless people in my neighborhood. Lock them up.
Yeah, and actually, you shared my Substack before, but the criminalizing disability. The last article I wrote was about the expansion of conservatorship laws for homeless people, and also involuntary confinement. They're using this mental health system that's supposed to help to just like mass diagnose people in order to take their resources.
Because
conservatorship means the state gets your money.
This is the real world consequences of conservatives saying in response to mass shootings, well, this is about mental health.
Right.
And liberals saying in response to conservatives, well, what are you doing about mental health? And so now we're seeing this use of mental health to expand the police state in a way that allows conservatives and liberals to agree on something, and they can say they're doing something about mental health, and really they're locking up homeless people.
And the investment firms are just shifting their prison resources from criminal prisons to psychiatric prisons.
So here's the
just really quickly, unless you live in New Jersey, where they actually have a whole fake prison where people get released and they think they're done, and the system has decided they're still a danger to society, and they just get picked up off the street and put in this space where they don't have access to anyone. I mean, and I don't know, I know that one exists in New Jersey, 100% certain. I know the address, I know where it is. I don't know, I would venture that New Jersey is not the only place that has one of these facilities. It's completely run by the Department of Corrections, but it's not considered a prison because it's supposedly for, people who are dealing with mental illness. So, these are also things that are part of this,
the place where they lock somebody up on the 24-hour mental health hold, right, or whatever. Yes.
Right. It's just this constant system of throwing people away when you decide that they're not going to be to the benefit of whatever part of society you think they're supposed to be benefiting.
And let's all remember that to a certain extent, this comes from, let's bring back the county mental health hospitals, or let's bring back the state mental health hospitals. Mm-hmm. That leads directly into this, because one of the reasons that homelessness went up when the state mental health hospitals were closed was because they were using mental health to criminalize and lock people up in the first place. And that actually became less difficult in some ways because of the closing of state hospitals.
Yeah, I mean, the conservatorship thing coming from Newsom really should be more shocking and upsetting. If the left were at all activated around disability, it would be. We had that moment with Britney Spears where it was this awareness that this is a really disgusting fascist system.
Got one for you for Newsom if you care about labor too, to bring back this intersection of why disabled people and working people should care about a lot of the same things and dislike the same people. Gavin Newsom gave a massive, you don't have to play by the COVID rules, get out of jail free card to the movie industry.
Right. The last bastion.
And now let's not keep in mind, because I know this from reading celebrities' social media posts, let's not forget how many people in the movie industry are disabled in some way.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you've got you have this workforce that is actually at more risk than some other workers being exposed by their employers with less care because they're an exception. They're essential workers. And if you didn't know that, you know it now. Gavin Newsom made Hollywood essential during the worst period of the COVID crisis. That's why your favorite TV show didn't go off the air.
Right. Right. And I was supposed to have a hard stop at noon, and it's
no,
now
and I
7:02, so
understand.
we have to go. But Justine, it was so nice to actually meet you. Even though it's on camera.
This is the seriously best thing about doing the YouTube show is you get to talk to people face to face instead of just on Twitter all the time. I love it.
It's
great. I feel the same way. And thank you so much for giving me the space to have this conversation. I'm really going to promote it. I really want people to understand these issues in long COVID.
Really appreciate you joining us, and thank you, Renee. I really appreciate you doing this.
I'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
And I am going to go ahead and wrap up myself in just a moment, folks. I do want to say that next week I will be joined by Bess Godin, who will be my co-host next week. And our guest will be Central Illinois radio host, Central Illinois DSA activist, and former No Amarin Shutoffs activist Ben Theobald, and co-host Bess Godin. So thank you very much, and I'll tweet at you. See you all next week.